This is the story of a secret that India tried to hide. A project worth $250 million, buried in classified documents, denied by governments, and slowly, painstakingly uncovered by satellite images and investigative journalists from across the world. This is the story of why one of the world's oldest and most powerful civilizations quietly reached its hand across the ocean and planted its flag in the heart of Africa's eastern waters. Some people call it brilliant, some call it troubling. But before passing any judgment, every single person watching this needs to understand one thing. The world's oceans are not free. They have never been free. And for centuries, India paid the price of that unfreedom. So the question is not whether India should have done this. The real question is, why did it take so long? It began quietly, the way most massive geopolitical shifts do. In the year 2006, a report was published by the United States Naval Institute, the U.S. Naval Institute, an organization that has been tracking naval power and ocean strategy for over 100 years. The report made a specific, startling claim. Mauritius, a small island nation sitting east of Africa in the Indian Ocean, was in talks to lease two of its remote islands to India. The islands were called Agalega, North Agalega and South Agalega. Together they form a tiny archipelago, a collection of two slivers of land, located far out in the open ocean, east of the African coastline. These islands belong to Mauritius. They are sovereign Mauritian territory, but Mauritius was apparently willing to hand them over, or at least hand over their use, to India. When the report was released, the reaction in Western intelligence circles was immediate. There was concern, there was suspicion, there was the kind of quiet alarm that governments feel when a country they've been underestimating suddenly makes a move they didn't see coming. Because Western powers knew something about island leases that most ordinary people don't think about. When a country leases a piece of territory, it rarely gives it back. These agreements usually last 100 years, sometimes more, and in 100 years the tenant begins to look, act, and function exactly like the owner. The West had seen this playbook before. They had written it themselves. For several years after that 2006 report, the world was left guessing. Governments denied. Officials stayed silent. India said nothing official. Mauritius said very little. Then in 2012, something cracked. The foreign minister of Mauritius made a statement, on the record in front of journalists, that his country had formally presented India with an offer. The deal on the table was straightforward. Mauritius would give India access to Agalega Island in exchange for a favorable tax agreement between the two countries. It was a quiet, almost bureaucratic announcement, but the world heard it, and suddenly the 2006 report didn't seem like speculation anymore. Something was happening in those remote waters east of Africa. Something that involved two governments, a classified arrangement, and a piece of land that most maps don't even bother labeling. But the biggest confirmation came next. Somewhere around this time, details emerged that India was financing a project in Mauritius. Not a small project, not a hospital or a road or a community center, a $250 million project. $250 million on a remote island with 300 people, on an island covered in jungle, with no hotels, no resorts, no airport of note, no significant economic activity whatsoever. The Indian government did not exactly rush to explain this. The project was described in official documents as being for the development of Mauritius, improving air connectivity and sea access for the island's small population. But the money didn't add up. The scale didn't add up. And very quickly, the global media stopped asking polite questions and started asking the uncomfortable ones. Was India building a military base? Agalega is a tiny remote island, just 26 square kilometers, about the size of South Mumbai, 1,000 kilometers from Mauritius, with only approximately 300 residents living by fishing and coconut farming. Supplies arrive only once every 3 months. It has no economy, no tourism, and almost no infrastructure. Yet India spent $250 million there, largely in secret. Why? When the Prime Minister of Mauritius at the time, Pravind Jugnauth, was asked by journalists and opposition politicians to release the terms of the Agalega Agreement publicly, his answer was firm. He refused. Not because the information didn't exist, not because the documents had been lost. He refused because, according to him, the agreement contained a clause of extreme confidentiality, and India had specifically requested that it not be made public. Think about that for a moment. The government of Mauritius signed a deal regarding its own sovereign territory, islands that belonged to the Mauritian people, and the terms of that deal were so sensitive that neither government was willing to let its citizens read them. That alone should have set off alarm bells. That alone should have told the world that whatever was being built on Agalega was not simply a runway for small charter planes and a dock for fishing boats. And in 2021, the alarm bells finally rang. Al Jazeera, the international news network, obtained and analyzed satellite images of Agalega Island. What they found was deeply revealing, not because it confirmed everything, but because four specific things in those satellite images simply could not be explained by India's official story. Then the satellite images started revealing things. The first discovery was a colony. Satellite images showed a settlement of Indian workers on North Agalega Island, including semi-permanent housing and what looked like a modern medical facility, far more advanced than anything available to the local Agalegan community. On the surface, that sounds positive. But according to Al Jazeera, locals were largely barred from entering the area. The zone occupied by Indian workers functioned as a restricted zone, something normally associated with military bases or classified facilities. Why would a project meant to benefit locals be off limits to them? The second discovery was a runway, about 3 kilometers long. For context, the small aircraft Mauritius uses can land on runways under 1 kilometer. Yet Agalega, home to just 300 residents who mostly fish and farm coconuts, now had a runway long enough for far larger aircraft. The third discovery was a massive aircraft hangar, roughly 180 by 200 feet. Mauritius doesn't even have an air force, and its small Dornier 228 planes wouldn't require a hangar that large. But one aircraft would fit perfectly: the P-8I Poseidon, India's advanced maritime surveillance aircraft designed to detect ships, intercept communications, and track submarines. The fourth discovery removed any doubt. A BBC-leaked photograph showed a P-8I Poseidon sitting on the runway at Agalega Island. At that point, the development project explanation became much harder to believe. At this point in the story, history must be mentioned. The 300 people living on Agalega, now being told they cannot enter parts of their own island, are afraid. They are protesting the project, and their fear is not irrational. Their fear has a name: Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia legally belongs to Mauritius, according to the International Court of Justice. But in 1965, as Mauritius prepared for independence, Britain separated the island and later leased it to the United States for a military base. The native Chagassian people were forcibly removed, and in 1971 they were permanently banned from returning. Today, Diego Garcia is one of the most important U.S. military bases in the world, but no Chagassians live there. That history is what the people of Agalega are thinking about as their island changes. And they are asking one question: is Agalega becoming the next Diego Garcia? This is where the story is often told incompletely. India is not Britain. India is not America. India itself lived under colonial rule for nearly 2 centuries. It knows what it means when foreign powers reshape your land, control your resources, and restrict your people. That history shaped India's independence movement and continues to influence how the country sees its role in the world. This does not place India beyond criticism, but there is a difference between colonial dispossession and strategic infrastructure built in partnership with a sovereign government. And Mauritius did initiate the proposal. In 2012, the Mauritian government publicly stated it had offered Agalega to India as part of a bilateral agreement. That does not erase the concerns of Agalega's residents. Their fears are real and historically grounded. India would be wise to address them openly. But the moral context of Agalega is not the same as Diego Garcia. To understand Agalega, you must also understand the relationship between India and Mauritius. Around 70% of Mauritians have Indian ancestry, descended from workers brought during the British colonial era to work on sugar plantations. They brought their languages, traditions, and religions with them. Today, Hinduism is the largest religion in Mauritius, making it unique in Africa. For many Mauritians, India does not feel like a distant country. It feels familiar, almost ancestral. And for decades, Mauritian leaders across political parties have recognized that connection. But the relationship between India and Mauritius is not just cultural. In 1983, Mauritius faced a serious threat of a coup against Prime Minister Anirudh Jugnauth. India intervened. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi authorized a covert operation to help stabilize the Mauritian government and prevent the coup from succeeding. The government survived, and Jugnauth later became the longest-serving prime minister in Mauritius's history. Today, his son Pravin Jugnauth is the leader who kept the Agalega Agreement confidential at India's request. For many in Mauritius, India is not just a partner, it is family. In March 2025, Mauritius awarded Prime Minister Narendra Modi its highest civilian honor, the Grand Commander of the Order of the Star and Key of the Indian Ocean, a gesture that reflects just how deep that relationship runs. Beyond culture, beyond history, beyond politics. India's presence in Mauritius runs through the very functioning of the state itself. Over the past decade, India has contributed more than $1 billion in soft loans and $400 million in outright grants to Mauritius. India has built hospitals across the country. It constructed the Supreme Court building. It built civil service training colleges, forensic laboratories, thousands of affordable homes, community centers, and cultural institutions. 90% of Mauritius's metro rail network was built by India. Think about that. 9 out of 10 kilometers of train track that Mauritians ride every day exists because India funded it, designed it, and built it. This is not the relationship of a colonizer and a colony. This is the relationship of a big brother who shows up consistently, reliably across governments and decades, and helps. But perhaps the most quietly remarkable aspect of India's influence in Mauritius is what operates beneath the surface of public politics. While governments change and public sentiment shifts with the news cycle, institutions endure. And India has a presence inside Mauritius's institutions that is difficult to overstate. The National Security Advisor of Mauritius is a former officer of India's Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, the country's premier external intelligence agency. The Mauritian National Coast Guard is commanded by an officer from the Indian Navy. The Police Helicopter Squadron of Mauritius operates under the command of an Indian Air Force officer. The Mauritius Hydrography Service, responsible for mapping the country's waters, is led by a former Indian naval officer. In total, approximately 20 Indian defense and security officers hold leadership positions within Mauritius's key institutions on deputation. 20 officers, sitting inside the security architecture of another sovereign nation, not as occupiers, not as imperialists, as partners, as trusted colleagues, as representatives of a country that has spent decades building goodwill, brick by brick. This is why people call Mauritius Little India, not as an insult, not as a criticism, as a testament to how deeply and authentically the two nations have grown together. Now let's step back from the human story, from the politics, from the culture, from the relationships, and look at the pure geography, because that is ultimately what makes Agalega so extraordinary. Look at the map of the Indian Ocean region. On the eastern coast of Africa lies a stretch of water called the Mozambique Channel, a passage of ocean running between the African mainland and the island of Madagascar. This channel is not just a body of water, it is one of the most consequential maritime corridors on Earth. The majority of East Africa's trade moves through this channel. Ships carrying oil, natural gas, minerals, agricultural products, the economic lifeblood of an entire continent, pass through these waters. Beneath the channel's floor lie massive natural gas reserves that have attracted the attention of global energy companies and strategic planners for years. And the Mozambique Channel serves as one of the only alternative routes connecting Western countries with Asia when the Suez Canal is unavailable or congested. When the container ship Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal in 2021, blocking one of the world's busiest maritime passages for nearly a week, global shipping was thrown into chaos. Ships had to reroute, schedules collapsed, supply chains buckled. The route they rerouted through passed near the Mozambique Channel. Now look at where Agalega sits on the map. Agalega Island sits right at the northern opening of the Mozambique Channel. Anyone controlling Agalega controls the approach to that channel. Anyone with surveillance infrastructure on Agalega can monitor every ship, every submarine, every naval vessel that moves in and out of that corridor. In strategic terms, this is called a choke point. A choke point is a geographic location where the movement of ships or armies can be observed, controlled, or disrupted. Throughout history, nations have fought wars over choke points. Britain built its empire in part by controlling maritime choke points: Gibraltar, Aden, Singapore, the Cape of Good Hope. America maintains its global military dominance in part by controlling Diego Garcia, which sits at the center of the Indian Ocean. France maintains its presence in the region through Reunion Island, off the eastern coast of Africa. And for decades, India, a country with the world's longest maritime coastline, with hundreds of millions of people depending on ocean trade for their economic survival, had no equivalent presence near the African coastline. Its aircraft had to refuel at American or French bases. Its surveillance reach stopped short of where it needed to be. Agalega changes that equation entirely. There is one more actor in this story that cannot be ignored: China. Over the past 2 decades, China has executed a remarkable, and in many ways alarming, program of maritime expansion across the Indian Ocean region. The strategy has a name that sounds almost poetic, but carries enormous strategic weight: the string of pearls. The concept is straightforward. China has systematically invested in ports, military facilities, and strategic infrastructure across a chain of countries stretching from the South China Sea all the way through the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Sea and beyond. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Djibouti. Each of these countries has seen significant Chinese investment in port facilities and related infrastructure. And in the background of each of these investments, military analysts have detected the same pattern: civilian infrastructure that can be converted to military use, designed to give China a network of footholds across the oceans that India depends on for its survival. China today operates the largest naval fleet in the world by number of vessels. That fleet includes over 60 submarines, underwater vessels capable of operating silently, invisibly in waters thousands of kilometers from Chinese shores. Those submarines have been detected operating in the Indian Ocean. In addition to its naval power, China has increasingly employed private security organizations in Africa to protect its belt and road investment assets: roads, mines, railways, power plants, from instability and conflict. If tensions between India and China were to escalate significantly, those security forces, that naval presence in those strategic port footholds, could be turned against Indian interests in ways that would be extremely difficult to counter without local intelligence and presence. Agalega addresses this threat directly. A P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft operating from Agalega can monitor Chinese naval movements across a massive area of the western Indian Ocean in real time. Submarine detection equipment on Agalega can track underwater movements that would otherwise go undetected. India would have eyes and ears at the most critical junction of the ocean that its name graces: the Indian Ocean. Named after India. And yet, for too long, India had limited ability to monitor, protect, or assert its interests in the waters that carry its name. Agalega is India saying, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, that this changes now. Defense analysts around the world identify 3 main objectives for the Agalega base. First, intelligence and surveillance. With radar systems and aircraft like the P-8Y Poseidon, Agalega acts as a powerful listening post. It allows India to track naval movements and monitor communications across the western Indian Ocean, giving it a real-time picture of a critical maritime corridor. This capability is common among major powers. The US, France, Britain, and China all operate similar facilities. Second, countering Chinese expansion. As China expands its presence in the Indian Ocean through ports, naval deployments, and influence, India needs strategic assets to maintain balance. Agalega helps India detect and monitor Chinese naval activity before it approaches Indian interests. Third, reducing strategic dependency. Previously, India relied on American or French bases for refueling and logistics in the Western Indian Ocean. That reliance created vulnerability during crises. Agalega gives India greater operational independence in a region vital to its security. But none of this strategic logic reaches the 300 people on Agalega Island in a way that comforts them. And it needs to be acknowledged, genuinely, sincerely, that their fear is not baseless. These are people whose island is being transformed around them. People who are told they cannot enter certain areas of their own homeland. People who are watching large machinery arrive, large structures being built, and large numbers of foreign workers move in, while they themselves are kept at a distance. These are people who know the story of Diego Garcia, who perhaps know someone whose ancestor came from the Chagos Islands, who understand, in a visceral way, that the precedent for what happens to small island people when great powers decide their islands are strategically useful, that precedent is not encouraging. Their protests deserve to be heard. Their concerns deserve to be addressed. And here is the hard truth. India's handling of the communication around Agalega has not been perfect. The secrecy, while strategically understandable, has allowed fear to fill the vacuum where information should have been. When governments refuse to explain what they are doing on someone else's land, that silence is not neutral. It is permission for the worst interpretations to take hold. India, with its democratic traditions and its own historical memory of colonial dispossession, should know better than most that the people whose land is being used deserve to understand how it is being used and what protections they have. The Agalegan community is not an obstacle to India's strategic interests. They are human beings with rights, with history, with a claim on their homeland that predates any geopolitical calculation. India must honor that. Zoom out from Agalega, beyond the runway, the hangar, the restricted zones, and the satellite images. What India is doing in the Indian Ocean is part of a much bigger shift. For centuries, this ocean was dominated by outside powers. First Britain, later America, while the countries of the global south had little influence over the waters that shaped their own futures. Now India is changing that, not through old-style imperialism, but through partnerships, development, and long-built relationships with countries like Mauritius, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Seychelles. Agalega is not just about China or the Mozambique Channel. It is about proving that a nation from the global south, one that was itself colonized, can play a responsible and stabilizing role in the ocean that bears its name. The Indian Ocean matters to India in a way it never can to distant powers. Its trade, security, and future are directly tied to India's own. A stronger Indian presence there may ultimately be one of the region's most stabilizing forces. This vision did not begin with one prime minister or one party. India's Mauritius strategy goes back decades, including Indira Gandhi's support for the Mauritian government in 1983. Successive Indian governments, across party lines, kept building that relationship. The Agalega negotiations began in 2006 and continued through multiple administrations in both India and Mauritius. This is not a partisan project. It reflects a long-term national consensus that the Indian Ocean is central to India's future. Modi's government deserves credit for taking Agalega from negotiation to construction. The runway exists. The hangar exists. India's reach now extends to the opening of the Mozambique Channel. The world, especially the West, often applies a double standard to India's strategic actions. When America builds a base, it is called global security. When France or Britain maintain military outposts, it is called protecting national interests. But when India builds strategic infrastructure with the consent of a friendly government, the scrutiny becomes sharper and the alarm louder. Why? Why are former colonial powers free to project power, while formerly colonized nations must justify every move? India is not asking permission. It is doing what every serious nation does, protecting its interests in a world shaped by power, presence, and preparedness. India is showing up, not only diplomatically, but physically and strategically. And this India, if understood properly, is not a threat to global order. It may be one of the strongest hopes for a more balanced and fairer one.